I remember a source had this tape recording I referenced that was recorded in the Giants clubhouse. It was Greg Anderson, Bond's weight trainer, describing in detail Barry's drug use. And I remember when a source played that for me the first time. And that was my moment that A, it was true, and B, I think we're going to get this in the paper someday.
I think I had a couple of holy shit moments. The first holy shit moment about recognizing that this could be huge was not that long after the raid. We got a tip at the paper from somebody who clearly was inside, or at least knew somebody who was inside the investigation, and laid out the number of athletes who were involved and that they were all getting performance-enhancing drugs from Conte and Balco, and Bonds was at the center of that.
Mark and Lance, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
It's my pleasure.
Great to be here.
I'm excited to get into Game of Shadows. I was telling Mark before we linked up for the podcast when we were messaging offline that I've played baseball for almost 20 years. And obviously Game of Shadows and the whole Balco scandal goes into baseball, and the steroid scandal. And maybe I should have taken steroids, at least tried it, because of some of the numbers that I see in this book. It's something that seems to definitely affect performance. But I wanted to ask you guys to start off. So Game of Shadows, it's over 250 pages of investigative journalism. It's detailing one of the biggest scandals in sports, which is the uncovering of rampant steroid use at the highest levels of athletics and the international web of steroid distribution run by Victor Conte of Balco. How did your interest in this massive story begin, and what pulled you into it?
Mark was the first man in, so let him start.
So I actually got assigned to the story. I was working at the Chronicle, actually on this investigative unit that Lance is on. I had been a sports writer doing sort of features and enterprise and that kind of stuff. And I was on loan to this investigative unit trying to see if I could do this kind of work or more of it. That was not really sports related. And then Balco broke. There was this raid on this lab that nobody had ever heard of. And because there were a number of top athletes and famous athletes associated with it, most notably Barry Bonds in the Bay Area, but a whole host of other really famous athletes, when you went to the website, I was asked to sort of look into it. The stories that had broke at that point were, I think there was a local newspaper that had reported on the raid, and a local TV station that had also reported on the raid. There was not really a sense of what was going on. It was being led by the Internal Revenue Service. So no one really knew, was this just a tax case that didn't have anything to do with the athletes? But because Bonds and some others were associated, it was sort of made sense for us to take a look. And so I got assigned to basically just dig in and see if there was anything there. And over the course of the first couple weeks of reporting, learned that there was this investigation that was rooted in the distribution of performance-enhancing drugs to these athletes. It was an IRS case because the reality was, these were illegal drugs, and the mastermind of the deal, Victor Conte, this guy, he couldn't be selling them legally. And so any money made was not being reported to the IRS, and so it became a tax case. And but I just began looking into it. We found out that there was a grand jury impaneled. We found out that Bonds had been subpoenaed and a number of other top athletes. And, we began to hear about the use of performance-enhancing drugs. And so, it's at that point I happen to be sitting next to Lance in a cubicle, and, and it was sort of a natural thing. Our boss said, look, why don't you join Mark and you can work on this with him for a bit, and we can see where this thing goes.
Actually, What was going on was this new guy came to the I team and framed up this story in amazing terms, and I knew this because I was sitting next to him. He created a sort of wish list of everybody who might know about performance-enhancing drugs and elite sports, and then started calling them up and charmed them. And I'm listening his approach, and then starts popping scoops. The basic facts of Balco, the kind of stuff that George Will, years later, being interviewed by Ken Burns, just spouts off as though they're routine. Mark had to fight to get that it was a steroid investigation. He had that scoop. He had a scoop that grand jury was looking at it. He had a scoop that Bonds had been subpoenaed to testify. So the day came when our boss and editor, Steve Cook, brought me in and said, the story's too big for one guy. I got to put you on it. And I'm like, sure, I'll do it. What is it? This was one of the few times in my career where I said, I don't wanna. And I told him, look, I don't know anything about the story, and this guy is doing a great job. And I hate those partnerships where both guys are interviewing the same people. It doesn't make any sense. I said I just didn't want to do it. And my boss was like, well, he can use some help pulling documents. You can work on some profiles. And then, as Mark knows the story, and then he said, and don't worry, I'll have you off the story by Christmas. This was in October of 2003, and my last Balco story, I think I wrote in 2015. He didn't say Christmas of what year.
Yeah, many Christmases from now. So
the reality is I was desperate for Lance to join. Like, he's making it like he didn't know what there was to do. The story looked like it was just, endless and a whole lot of places to go. And I was doing okay, but I was really eager for his assistance. So it turned out to be, a partnership that was perfect for us.
Yeah. And you mentioned it seems so obvious now to connect the dots and looking back at all the documentaries and things that have been made about the steroid scandal. But from my perspective, I was only 12, 13 years old at the time, around when this was breaking. So I was just a kid. But there was like this untouchable, godlike thing around a lot of these athletes. And it would come out when I would have conversations with my dad, because things were going on in the news that he was reading and I wasn't reading. And I remember him saying things like, like steroids it's bullshit. Like, these guys put in hard work and this is all just kind of, it's kind of like woo stuff. There's not really anything there to it. There was a lot of mixed opinions and people going all out on opposite ends of the spectrum. Like, yeah, obviously athletes are on steroids. Look at them. Look at the 90s. Look at the guys before that. And then, it's all just hard work. Like, it's not steroids. People that say that are just jealous, like shit like that. And then to see what it turned into now, over a decade later, 2 decades later, is unbelievable.
Well, there was
how massive it was.
Yeah, well, there was tremendous audience resistance to the story we found. People just, today, sports fans today all know about performance-enhancing drugs, whether they like it, hate it, don't care about it, but that's just part of sports. You know about that. But at the time we were doing these stories, most fans, and of course, even people who owned baseball teams didn't seem to know much about them. And when you told them that their heroes were drug cheats, the initial reaction was, "You're lying. You're making it up." We got emails and calls at the paper. Giants fans, they just couldn't accept that the home run king had done anything wrong. Later, after it was obvious that the stories were true, then it became, well, so what? Everybody does it. But that's sports for you. That's fans.
Mm-hmm. Mm. And so Victor Conte was the guy running everything behind the scenes, the distribution of the steroids. He was the one building relationships with athletes. And there's a couple sentences in the book that stood out to me when describing Victor Conte. And you guys wrote, Victor Conte is kind of a power-driven guy. He gets in there and he likes to stir the pot. Victor was always the go-getter, always one scam or another. And he was one of those guys who liked to play all angles and was good at it. So for people who aren't familiar with who Victor Conte was and how he had his grip and everything, who was the man, Victor Conte? Where did he come from? Like, how is he building these relationships with superstar athletes, Barry Bonds, Marion Jones, Bill Romanowski? Like, how did he become the big hitter of Balco?
I mean, I think, Victor he's an amazing character. Lance and I always used to laugh. Like, you just can't make him up. Like, he's almost too good to be true as a character to write about. Victor grew up in Fresno in the Central Valley of California. He was a successful athlete in high school, a track star. And, but he was a kid who sort of always had clearly designs on, he had very charismatic guy, designs on sort of finding a way to lead. He was clearly a guy who saw himself as a leader. He was also a musician. He played bass, and he tried to sort of make it as a bassist at various points. And he even, there's a point where he's got a cousin who's in the band Tower of Power, which is a fairly famous Bay Area band. And Victor sort of finagles his way into the band. And this is a really, popular, long-standing band. And the next thing you know, Victor is basically trying to like overthrow the band. He's trying to become the leader. And this is sort of the mentality of who this guy was. And they promptly, there's a scene in the book where they basically just kick him out of the band and as he's trying to make his move. But he evolves into this guy. He's sort of this chameleon-like figure. He revolves into this guy who gets into the supplement business in the early days of that industry. And he creates this sort of like whole idea that he can mastermind the specifics of what supplements you need to make your body more effective, to perform at a more effective level, not just high-level athletes, but anybody. He spends a lot of time in the Stanford Library reading about these substances and then ultimately also about steroids. And he evolves into this guy who he creates this idea that he's gonna do this thing where he measures the levels you have of certain vitamins and in your body, and he's going to tell you what you're missing. And inevitably what you're missing is this product that he has made, this zinc and magnesium product he's made. And he says everybody needs it. Everybody needs more zinc and magnesium. And this is the way to survive. And he builds this industry, and this is his legal industry. And what he does is a sort of ultimately a fairly traditional marketing move where he aligns himself with high-profile athletes who will sort of sing the praises of his product called ZMA. But what he really does to take this to the next level and why he becomes a figure in our lives is that he aligns himself with these athletes and he becomes basically their steroid dealer. He ends up being their connection to a range of substances. And in return, what they do for him is they market his legal product. And so basically, and sometimes they pay him. So there's a mixed bag of him getting money, of him in exchange for marketing. He's giving them a range of performance-enhancing drugs. And he's cocktailing these different kinds of drugs. He's connecting with certain people who have access to them. And he's creating, in his mind, some of the greatest athletes in the world. And in fact is. His work with, Tim Montgomery, for example, leads to Montgomery becoming the world's fastest man. His work with Bonds clearly leads Bonds to become the home run king. And it's in that context that you end up connecting with Victor. The one thing I'll say, and then, Lance will probably have a bunch to add on Victor, but Lance always said that the biggest problem with Victor is that, one of his lawyers described him as having narcissistic personality disorder. which is, of course, the last thing you really want in a drug dealer, right? Like, if you're, Lance always says, like, you don't want your drug dealer to be having narcissistic personality disorder. He's just drawing attention to himself.
No, yeah,
he was not a quiet guy. He wanted to be celebrated for how good he was.
Hey guys, this is a quick reminder that the two best ways you can support the show are by 1, leaving a rating and comment on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. This is like foreplay for the algorithm because it revs it up and makes our show appear higher in searches. And number 2, you can subscribe to AUXORO Premium at auxoro.supercast.com, where for $5 a month you get bonus episodes and more exclusive content. Thank you for however you choose to support the show. You want a drug dealer who occasionally takes his own drugs if it's psychedelics, so he floods out his ego and he just wants to be good at his job and not be the star of the show.
Victor would go to the great track meets in the U.S. and Europe, and he became known as the man with the little black bag. And he'd sidle up to athletes and he'd say, "You see how she's running? That's because she's working with me. You ought to work with me." And so this is how Balco unravels. The other track coaches know what's going on, and one of them gets a sample of one of the undetectable steroids he's distributing and gives it to the authorities, and away we went.
Yeah, and he's such an interesting guy, the way, the things that he was involved in, and that profile builds throughout the book, because he had ties to the music industry. He was in Tower of Power. He was also in the supplement industry. So he has the knowledge of chemical compounds to where he can probably oversee things, tell what may make a good combination, give directions to chemists and things like that. But he's also creative and wants to be the star of the show. So it's like this perfect storm, this perfect whirlwind of personality traits that would allow you to, like, you're more than the drug dealer to the stars. It's like, do you know how sometimes when an artist puts out a song and a producer will be on the song, but most of the time you'll just see the artist's name? I feel like in a way, Victor Conte was like the producer putting his name as the star of the song, like the performer, the person writing the melodies, the person who was writing the lyrics. Like, he wanted to be involved in everything and be seen as this guy who, like, yeah, look at me, like Barry Bonds, he's an extension of me. Like, I am creating him, like almost like painting Barry Bonds, like all these brushstrokes with the performance enhancing drugs.
Yeah. Got combination mad scientist, marketing guru, and wants all the credit.
Yeah, they with Montgomery, they literally created a thing they called Project World Record. The whole thing was designed like, we're going to create Tim Montgomery and turn him into a world record holder. And integral to that, of course, was the drugs. And they were, I think, incredibly proud of the idea that they could tout that they had created Montgomery. That was
who went on to win the 100-meter world record while using Victor's drugs. And the other thing I remember on Montgomery is he gave you a window into how competitive athletes think and feel, and the extent to which they want to win. He told Victor that he'd take whatever Victor gave him. He didn't care if he dropped dead at the finish line, as long as he could win that 100-meter record. That's why you have sports leadership to regulate sports, because one thing you want to do is protect the athletes from their own competitive instincts, don't you? You don't really want a sport where guys are literally risking their lives to get a record. And that's one of the things that I often thought about in the context of Balco. Most of the guys we wrote about were just really competitive athletes. They weren't very sophisticated in certain ways. They weren't old guys. And the people running the sports owed it to them to regulate their behavior, whether they liked it or not. But that isn't what was happening.
Yeah, and to play devil's advocate a little bit. So take baseball for instance. You're playing 162 games a year. You're performing hundreds of times a year. You're expected to perform at the top level. There's millions of dollars on the line. You're highly replaceable. And steroids weren't being tested for many decades in baseball, even though it was illegal at the federal level. How much of this was on the shoulders of the players, the steroid scandal, like the players and the chemists and Conte for running the operations, and how much of this was kind of a hole in the system that the owners and the front offices of the MLB and other organizations set up to be exploited? But like, of course, if with everything on the line, with the money and the performance incentives, if you leave a gap, those things are going to be exploited for sure. So how much do you blame the system and how much do you blame the athletes?
I mean, I think there's plenty of blame. There's plenty of blame to go around, right? Like,
yeah.
You know, I think, look, as Lance sort of was pointing out, you can't in some ways really blame the athletes for the choices they made. You know, these guys are highly competitive. The payoff is valuable. The drugs work clearly. And so it's no surprise that somebody would make this choice. Yeah. You know, similarly from baseball's perspective, I mean, if you remember the context of Balco emerging, I mean, it comes right in the wake of the, you know, not too far after the cancellation of the 1994 World Series and the lockout and strike, and so you have this dynamic in which baseball is surging back amidst Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa hitting home runs that turn out to be flawed, and you know, baseball is enjoying its revival, and the owners are enjoying their revival, and so, you know, the idea that they would want to do anything that could possibly sort of squelch that, you know, would not be in their best interest. And so it's not surprising that baseball wouldn't be aggressive about this. I mean, the owners will tell you that the reason that they didn't have drug testing is because the Players Association stood in their way of getting it done. And I think there's some of that truth. There's some truth to that for sure. At the same time, I don't think owners were clamoring to actually have legitimate testing. But again, in reality, Balco says it didn't really matter, right? Because you could design the use of these drugs without being caught. And the athletes made these choices, and they have to own the choices that they made. And, you know, people make this distinction you made oftentimes about, well, they weren't banned in baseball yet. And you noted they were illegal under federal law. This is not the way they were designed to be distributed, designed to be used. And I remember doing a story after I left the Chronicle. I went to ESPN, where I am now, and we did a story on a player who was named in this report, the Mitchell report, that outed and sort of followed our reporting and outed a number of athletes who'd used the drugs and in baseball. And it was an unknown pitcher named Dan Nolte. And I remember talking to Nolte about his use, and Nolte was like, look, I have great considerable guilt at this point over my choice to use these drugs, because it's clear that the choice I made kept me in the league at the expense of other guys who did not make it. And, you know, and that's one of the realities of making these choices. And so if the players were okay with doing that, then they were fine doing it for the sake of the money. But they have to own the choice that they made.
Yeah. It's I'm conflicted with how I think about it, because in one way it was illegal. It was against the law to be taking these drugs. You know, although, you know, people take drugs that are illegal all the time for their own benefit. Like I smoked weed long before it became decriminalized in New York. But on the other hand, it's almost like a lot of it reminds me of making a good investment in a way, where you see an avenue to exploit that no one else does. And Victor Conte was 100%, you know, he seems like a narcissistic, complex, just seems, thought he was smarter than he was. He seemed like that type of character where he thought everything was under control. And that seems like it ultimately led to his downfall. But at the beginning of this story, it was like this hole in sports let's go stick with baseball for the example, but this hole in baseball where steroids aren't being tested for. It's illegal, yes, but you have proof that these drugs will help with the performance of athletes, and I'm going to design undetectable steroids to give these athletes and monitor the schedule and essentially evade these testing programs for years and years and years. I wouldn't say admirable is the wrong word, but like there's something there where it's like if that was on a different track, he could have been an insanely successful person. Like if he used that for something else, like investing in the market or something, like I don't know. It seems like there's a skill set there that could have been exploited that wouldn't have led him down this path.
An absolute disregard for the health and safety of the people he's giving the drugs to. Recall that the Clear was a drug developed to fatten beef cattle for slaughter. There's absolutely no way of knowing what the long-term effects of human beings taking that is. They had never been tested. He doesn't care. There was another point where he's giving everybody insulin. And one of the athletes says, you're going to kill somebody doing this stuff, because he was risking the way he was. He didn't know anything about insulin, and he's giving it to them. And there's a danger of going into insulin shock and even dying if you flood it. He didn't care. So Victor's a kind of by any means necessary guy, but he had limited concern for anybody other than himself, I always thought.
Do you know how much he knew about the drug's effect versus how much he was telling the athletes? So obviously he knew all the negative effects and you know, as much as he was able to test for and research, how much of that was he communicating to guys like Bonds and Tim Montgomery? Like, we have no research on this. This may fuck you up. It may not, but if you want, you can take this. Was he being that honest about it, or was he kind of finessing it?
I mean, I don't think there's anything from the testimony, if I recall correctly. Lance may remember better than I do, but I don't remember anything from the testimony that suggests that there were extensive conversations, you know, like you would have with your doctor about the potential negative effects of these drugs, the side effects that you're likely to have, and whether you really want to take them. And I think the reason that that clearly was not part of the dynamic, or I think that I feel it seems logical that wasn't what was going on, is because you had guys. I think the thing that always struck me about this, you had guys cocktailing a whole range of substances at levels that they're not designed to be taken anyway medically. So the idea that like Victor could speak with any authority other than anecdotally about what is the impact of taking human growth hormone along with the Clear, along with the cream, along with some insulin possibly, and any other mix of substances that were part of the cocktail, that the idea that he could speak with any authority about the potential impact of using those drugs seems sort of far-fetched. Because again, as Lance pointed out, there's not legitimate testing that's been done on humans for the use of these substances, and certainly not at the levels they're taking them or as they're being cocktailed.
Yeah, so it sounds like these athletes were pretty expendable to Conte. As long as they were performing, it was fine. And if they dropped out, he would just find the next guy or the next girl.
But I don't think they were. I mean, this is not a defense of Victor, but I don't think, like, it's not like these athletes were dumb. It's not like they were, they knew what they were doing, and they were willing, to take these risks, right? They were willing to decide that this was worth whatever the implications might be for them.
Yeah.
Bonds tried to check out the drugs, I recall. He had been advised by people close to him, don't do this. You don't need to do this. You're already going to the Hall of Fame, and it could risk your health. So he then indirectly consulted a physician to try to check out the drugs. Had a friend go talk to the doctor. There was testimony of that. Remember? He goes to see Dr. Ting.
Right.
But ultimately was also advised by Greg Anderson, his weight trainer, that it ought to be safe as long as you don't take too much of the stuff, which is like, you go to your junior college dropout for your medical advice who's selling you the stuff.
Yeah. That sounds like what you would say to your friend picking up a bottle of allergy medication in CVS. Like, yeah, just don't take too much, and
absolutely, you'll be
fine. Let alone injecting 5 different drugs into your body every day and taking pills and shit like that.
Yes.
One of the most fascinating parts of the book I found was the personality profile you guys built of Barry Bonds, and I had come to know of the steroid aspects of what he did, taking performance enhancing drugs, how good he was as a baseball player. And there's always that line about Bonds that, yeah, if he didn't take steroids, he probably would have made it into the Hall of Fame anyway. And it's always about him as a professional and how skilled he was and how he didn't even need to do it, but he became this monster of a professional baseball player, arguably the greatest baseball player to ever live. And not a lot of people talk about his personality traits and, you know, just some of the stories you guys tell about how abusive he was and narcissistic and manipulative, and how he would treat Greg Anderson, who's his personal trainer, and other guys in the clubhouse, coaches. Could you talk about what you learned about Barry Bonds as a person during this investigation? And are there any specific stories that stick out that would give listeners an insight into, you know, who Barry Bonds was as a human being?
Well, Mark, I think, agrees with me. Barry had figured out that he could kick his game up to a higher level when everybody was mad at him. He seemed to learn how to feed off of negativity. And so he would go around and make outrageous statements and do abusive things and the whole bit, because it seemed to kick his game up a notch. We had a tape recording of his trainer talking about his drug use, but that was the other thing the trainer remarked on. We got to get him being an asshole again, because that's when he plays the best. Anyway, I mean, for example, just the kinds of hilarious but horrible things he would do. He's in the Giants clubhouse, and he's talking about his grandma, and he says, "My grandmother wants me to buy her one of those scooters that you ride around on. Why do I want to spend money on that when she's going to die anyway?" And everybody else is going, "Oh God, Barry."
Jesus.
But that kind of thing is just what he likes, because everybody's mad, getting the press mad, getting the club mad at him. He seems to play better. And I thought it was, it's the way he rolls, but I think he figured out a way to feed off it. There are so many bad interactions with cute little fan stories I've heard about, bad interactions with guys in wheelchairs wanting a baseball sign, just ridiculous stuff. I thought it's funny if you didn't have to actually experience it. I don't know. What do you think, Mark?
I mean, the thing that always struck me about Barry, people, in the media often talk about how bad he was to deal with, and how much he despised or demeaned the media. And my answer to that was always like, we didn't care. Like, as far as the reporting went, I wanted us to stay away to the extent we really only wanted to use stuff related to Barry that felt like it was in the context of the Balco story, so that it didn't feel like we were gratuitously piling on to Barry. But to me, the most telling thing about him was not that he hated the media, because a lot of people hate the media. I think the most telling thing was that there were not a lot of teammates or coaches you could find who liked playing or coaching him. The people who were around him most regularly, did not seem to, they appreciated his talent, but he was not a terribly popular guy amongst his teammates or coaches. And I think that was sort of the most telling thing about him.
Yeah.
It wasn't that he was a bad guy. I mean, there's a guy at the same time our book came out. There's a guy, Jeff Pearlman, another journalist who does a lot of fantastic work and has written a number of books. And he wrote the book that's based on this show now on the Lakers, Showtime.
Mm.
And Pearlman did a biography of Bonds. And that, but the laughable thing about that biography is it's just relentless. It's just relentlessly stories about what a dick Barry could be. Yeah. And, that was like so unappealing for us that like we heard all those stories as Lance said, but I think the challenge for us in working on Game of Shadows and in the reporting for the Chronicle was you didn't want to get buried in all of that shit for fear that people were going to think, oh, you're just trying to make Barry look bad. He made himself look, I mean, he did it on his own. He had no problem doing that. But I think for our part, his personality is fascinating. His background is fascinating. But I think it was a real challenge to avoid getting mired in how bad he could be.
Yeah. It's interesting because if he wanted to play the bad guy and like Lance was saying, he figured out this formula where if he could play the bad guy, get people mad at him, rile them up and go perform better. There are a bunch of athletes that do that today and they put on this character. They go out into the UFC ring. Like McGregor's kind of a guy like that who puts on this bad boy personality. Floyd Money Mayweather, like he makes people hate him, and that gets more people to watch, and that drives up ticket sales, and that probably gives them some sort of energy in the ring. But from the things that I've read and just pieces on figures like that, they don't seem unpleasant to be around outside of the ring or outside of performance. So if Bonds wanted to,
well, I would challenge you on those two guys.
McGregor and Mayweather.
Well, yeah, just in that, like, there's certainly reporting around Mayweather and abuse, and there's reporting around McGregor and that too. So I'm not sure those are the two best choices in trying to protect your point. I get your point.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, like, I think this idea of like presenting yourself in a certain way is a legitimate thing that's not necessary to carry over into your regular life.
Yeah, that may be. I just don't know enough about the personal lives and the accusations of Conor McGregor, and I know Mayweather's done some shady shit with money, and seems to have fucked over Logan Paul, which is a YouTuber that he just fought, and Logan Paul claims that he still hasn't paid him for the fight. So maybe those are bad examples, but just like the archetype of a player who builds this kind of bad boy villain persona and just keeps that in the ring, in the arena. And then once they're not playing, they're not that person anymore. It seems like Barry Bonds could have tried to do something like that, but from the profile in the book and from what you know about Barry Bonds' interactions, it seems like he just was that guy. Like he was this kind of piece of shit dude who wasn't putting it on to make people mad at him in the stands and kind of build himself up. Like it was truly pervasive in his life.
Yeah, I think there's...
Well, I was just going to say, well, he was a handful. I mean, but he could be charming as all get out, too, and often is today. He's doesn't act like that in public anymore very much. But he was tough on the people who were closest to him. And I think, golly, it's all about Barry, isn't it? And so you've been caught using steroids. You can mumble an apology, and that'll be the end of it. Or you can fight it in court for years and years, go to trial in which close friends, your ex-girlfriend, a family you're really close to are just ripped apart by the spectacle. And it's just all about you. You don't care. I think it's that self-centeredness really doesn't empathize against others. And sometimes it's not very attractive.
And Barry Bonds was playing, well before the age of Instagram and Facebook. So a lot of these interactions that would have been caught on cell phones and went viral on TikTok, the people didn't have a chance to post that and put that up back then. So perhaps that saved him a bit with his public image that he came after the advent of social media.
We met a TV guy in New York who tried to interview Barry during a rain delay. Do you remember this, Mark? And Barry says, "Get that camera out of my face or I'll cut your throat." And then I said, "Well, did you put it on the air?" And he goes, "Of course not."
Yeah, that leads today.
Yeah, it would.
What do we know about the drug regimen that Bonds was following under Conte and under Greg Anderson? Because there's a lot of speculation out there for people who haven't read the book or for people who haven't read testimony, investigated, just in everyday conversation, Bonds took steroids, but like, what did he actually take? So what do you know about his regimen specifically and what he was putting into his body?
So it's been a few years. Lance may remember better than I have, or looked at the calendars more recently and prepared better. So there are calendars. There's a range of evidence that notes Barry's use and describes in detail what Barry was using, including calendars. And the drug calendars include him using human growth hormone, the cream, which was this sort of drug you rubbed on your body, which was a mix of testosterone and this stuff called epitestosterone, designed specifically to avoid detection. This drug, the Clear, that Lance talked about earlier, which was a sort of specifically designed substance, or an old steroid from years ago that was more for cattle, I think. Insulin. There was a female fertility drug, I think, right, Lance, that was also part of the mix that was designed. I think that the purpose for taking that was to refresh testosterone levels after they'd tanked following use. What am I missing, Lance? There was this there's a big cocktail of stuff people were using.
I think you hit most of it. The calendars were kept by his weight trainer, Greg Anderson. They overlaid the Giants' schedule. And so you could look at him and say, well, in San Diego, he's going to be hitting the insulin tonight, this kind of thing. They wanted Barry to lay off sometimes for health and other reasons. Sometimes Barry thought they were being too conservative and would juice himself if he had if he wanted to play particularly well or didn't think he was playing well enough right now.
Was there a holy shit moment for you guys where you kind of both looked at each other during the investigation and you realized that this wasn't just a few athletes, this wasn't just athletes from one or two countries, like this is a worldwide ring? Was there a holy shit, like this is bigger than we thought moment?
Mine was slightly different. We were covering this big story, but of course it focused on the biggest sports star in our region and on the local baseball team. So our focus was Bonds. And I remember Mark had heard early on that Barry was using steroids, and he had enough unnamed sources that under ordinary circumstances you just print it. But the paper was like, nobody's going to believe a story based on unnamed sources that Bonds is using steroids, so we couldn't go that route. Mm-hmm. I remember a source had this tape recording I referenced that was recorded in the Giants clubhouse, and it was Greg Anderson, Bond's weight trainer, describing in detail Barry's drug use. And I remember when a source played that for me the first time, and that was my moment that A, it was true, and B, I think we're going to get this in the paper someday, because it was absolutely conclusive evidence to me. And that was when I was like, holy moly, we're going to get there. There were other moments too, Mark. Mark, you may have scored some documents that were pretty telling.
I mean, I think I had a couple of holy shit moments. The first holy shit moment about like recognizing that this could be huge was not that long after the raid. We got a tip at the paper from somebody who clearly was inside, or at least knew somebody who was inside the investigation, and laid out the number of athletes who were involved and that they were all getting performance-enhancing drugs from Conte and Balco, and Bonds was at the center of that. And so just sort of seeing that tip and seeing it all come together in that way, and knowing that we might have access to somebody who had some real insights and knowledge about how huge this thing was, that was a fairly, like, holy shit moment for sure. Although, as Lance said, the paper was dubious about whether we could get that, I think. I think we might have been dubious too initially. And then, I think when we had instances where we got, we got access to grand jury testimony or investigative documents. I mean, it's interesting. The first story we had that flat out talked about Bonds receiving these drugs in a documented way was based on an investigative document in an interview with Conte, and in which he said, in talking to investigators, that Bonds had been one of the athletes he'd given the drugs. And I remember Lance and me both sort of working up that story and thinking, okay, this is it. We finally have the sort of like, so-called smoking gun, or anybody who has doubts now can't have doubt anymore.
Yeah.
And I remember laughing. This goes back to what Lance was talking about earlier. We published that story, and the reaction among a lot of Giants fans was, well, you said he got the drugs. You didn't say he used them.
Yeah. Yeah, he's just stockpiling testosterone and HGH in his apartment.
I'm like, that's when you that's when you realized, at least to some Giants fans, you were going to need to have actually a picture of him injecting himself in his ass.
Yeah.
But I thought that was a sort of holy shit moment in its own weird way.
Yeah. Where do you think we are today with the rogue chemists versus the testing organizations? Because I had no idea that the testing organizations like USADA had to have the specific molecule to test for. I thought it was kind of like a broad thing where you can kind of do a broad stroke test and a bunch of things pop up and abnormalities. And if there's an abnormality, like bang, like this is it. I had no idea that you had to have a specific test to test for that drug in particular. Do you think that the chemists are ahead of the testing organizations for the most part today? Do you think the testing organizations are just like blanket covering all the options somewhere in the middle? Where do you think we are on that with pro sports?
I mean, I will fully admit, we haven't covered this story in years, and so I haven't been covering steroids and performance-enhancing drugs in the way that we used to. But I do have a sense, both from colleagues who are covering it and also just the ongoing reporting around it and the background of our reporting. The reality is, guys are going to keep using if they want to keep using. The drugs are out there, they work, and the cheaters are always ahead of the testers. I think the testing has got considerably better. They do test for. It's true that to be able to detect that specific drug, they needed to be able to find out about it to be able to do it. Yeah. But in most cases, there's a panel of drugs that they're testing for, and the range of those and the impact of those can be found. At the same time, there's still, no great testing for human growth hormone. There's still without blood testing. And, or at least that effective. And then a lot of athletes have learned ways to microdose that are effective. I'm pretty cynical about this. I think the idea, I always laughed when I knew why they did it, but I always laughed when baseball talked about its steroid era, as if it was this defined period in time that was over once Balco hit, right? Like, that is such horseshit. The idea that now that they have testing, they've solved this problem is ludicrous.
They've certainly, though, learned to be cool about it. I mean, we were hearing stories at when things were before steroids were banned in baseball. There were guys who didn't want to slide because they had their syringes in their hip pocket. Ball players. I mean, it was pretty out there. Jose Canseco stuff. And
is that actually is that a thing that guys were doing, or is that just kind of bullshit? The syringe in the pocket.
I heard it. I heard it in the context of Canseco's stuff, but how far is that from Mac and Jose going in the men's room of the Oakland Coliseum before the game and injecting each other? It's just out there stuff. It's no longer out there like that for sure, right, Mark?
Yeah. Well, I believe, obviously, Canseco admits that he was taking steroids, but putting it in your pocket seems like just dumb. Like that, I put in college, the rule was that tobacco was illegal. Like, our coach would kind of wink at us, like, don't do tobacco. And what he was really saying was, don't have it in your pocket, don't have it on you on the field. But you can, if you pack a lip and it's not a circle tin in your back pocket, who gives a shit? Like, I'm not going to get fined for that. But if you get me in trouble, I'll get you in trouble. That was the message. So having the syringe in the pocket and then like sliding and stabbing yourself in the ass, that seems so stupid. It would be another level. Like, I would question, how does that person walk around?
I think it seems apocryphal. At the same time, like, we heard so much shit. Obviously, we didn't publish half of the shit we heard, but I think what it speaks to and what Lance is getting at is that, the era is very different. Like, the evolution of focus and expertise on ways to beat the system and the need to beat the system is very different, right?
Yeah.
Like, then, although players were hiding it because they didn't want anybody to know because they knew it was wrong, they hadn't been banned by baseball. It was a different animal and approach to sort of dealing with it. And so you had a sort of Wild West component, just like you had around a Wild West component around the supplement.
Mark and I did some stories on a online steroid, steroids by mail business in Florida. And we found big league ball players having their drugs sent to them at the ballpark. That seemed kind of uncool to me.
Yeah, and
there is an imperviousness. Yeah, I think there is an imperviousness that sort of ends up happening when you reach that level.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. No, it's like, you think, who's going to catch you? I get that. Just getting to a level where you're like, no one's going to stop me. I'm getting paid massive amounts of money. I'm in the media all the time. People love me. Who's going to ride on me? Who's going to get me in trouble? And, there were parts in the book where there were reporters would go into the locker room and they're just bottles of androstenone. I forget the name of the steroid, but like visibly bottles of pills that were steroids in guys' lockers during interviews. And it was just like, we're not gonna. Why would we hide it? No one gives a shit.
Yeah, there was a sense of no consequences. I think that's over. Now there are some consequences, and maybe people are cooler about it.
Yeah. To go back to the chemist race for a second, the chemists versus the testing organizations, I just don't see how the chemists or how the testing organizations like USADA would ever get ahead of the rogue chemists. And this is my very, unexpert opinion. I'm not an expert in chemistry, molecular biology, which surprises no one. But if you're able to design a steroid and design a molecule and alter it slightly and make infinite number of alterations to that molecule, and then to have that be a performance enhancing drug and not have a specific test for it. Maybe it's even outside of the more broad spectrum test for steroids. It shows up as an abnormality, but there's no way to know exactly what it is. If the possibilities are infinite, and then the testing organizations have a finite amount of drugs they can test for, it kind of seems like a cop trying to pull over 100 people that are speeding. It's like, I could pick one or two of them, but 97 of these guys are getting away. So to me, I just never see a place where, as long as the incentive is there for athletes to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for chemists to figure out the combinations of certain drugs and the whole black market behind the scenes, how that would ever stop.
We met scientists who said you could devise foolproof testing, but it would be enormously expensive, and you'd have to get all the medical experts who are trying to cure diabetes to switch their efforts. But they felt it was technically possible to have a test that would not look at a particular substance, but look at your body's reaction to the substance. I mean, it could be done, but there's, on the part of the sports organizations, there's a limited appetite for having foolproof testing as well. And I don't think they want to pay for that.
Well, nor do they want to, because they, I think the question partly becomes too, how much will is there to actually, from the sporting bodies, how much will is there to actually rid yourself of this stuff? I mean, people always talked about baseball, obviously, in the context of Balco, but, I always found football the most fascinating because in many ways, football got a free pass on this issue forever, partly because they were sort of much better at PR and dealing with the government on this issue, partly because they implemented a testing policy back in the 90s, even if it wasn't that effective. But it's crazy to believe when you look at how physically violent and demanding that sport is, the idea that athletes would not be using a range of substances to enhance and survive the sport is naive, right? And yet, there's only a handful of guys getting caught here and there. And so part of it is a question of will, I think, and by the sports governing bodies. Part of it is a money issue, as Lance said. And again, it is, I too am no molecular scientist, and I'm no expert at sort of this. And again, I haven't been covering this part of it for years. But I think it's telling that when guys get caught these days, and you hear about it, more often than not, it's somebody stupidly using an old-time steroid that was a bodybuilder steroid, right?
Yeah.
It's not because they were getting caught using something that's surprising to people. And that's because the cheaters generally are ahead of the testers, and there's a lot of ways to beat the system still.
Could you ever see a world where steroids and other performance-enhancing drugs were, assuming that, let's leave federal legality out of it, would you see a world where it becomes legal in sports and paired with increased testing and monitoring, so you're probably not getting tainted drugs, and you can actually go to team doctors and figure out, if you're going to take something, this is the right way to do it? Do you ever see a world where someone like UFC, MLB, NFL just drops it and just lets it go to whoever wants to take it, because ultimately it may be safer for the athletes?
You'd have to decriminalize it. And so that would be a practical impediment. I don't know if the fans would appreciate it being that upfront. Mark's talked about sports being reduced to a battle between who has the best team chemist. I don't know how fans would react either.
That's a good point. Your chemist would be just as important or more important than your manager, your general manager. Everyone's trying to get the best chemist in the league.
And he'd have a big contract, and someone would try to woo him away.
Guaranteed
the Red Sox
money.
are getting the Dodgers drug master. I don't know. It's a weird world.
You'd have
I also think
you'd have a percentage of the salaries of players on your team. So if you were a chemist and a guy hit 60 home runs, maybe you get 10% bonus or something on people's performance. It opens up a lot of doors.
Okay.
It opens a lot of big can of worms. I mean, and then what do you do about, okay, so say, you get past the decriminalization piece, right? Say the feds drop this issue and decide it's fine to do whatever you want to do. So then the next question is, okay, you've legalized it at the pro level. Do you legalize it at the college level? And what are the so what are the implications of that? And if the message is that, like, to be able to succeed at the pro level, we want you to use these substances and you're going to need to use these substances, well, then don't you need to start using them as you're younger? And then what's the point in which you're comfortable sending the message, to young people that, like, this is the way to succeed at the highest level? I think it just opens up a whole series of can of worms that nobody's probably prepared to deal with, or police.
Yeah, that's it. So, I mean, it's been about 4 or 5 years since I've stopped playing college baseball, but I can tell you that even though it's illegal or not, but it's banned from taking steroids in the MLB and minor leagues, that there's still a huge trickle down effect into college with it being banned. And also compared to professional baseball, what I know about the testing in pro baseball, like the NCAA testing is an absolute joke and guys make fun of it all the time. I never took steroids, never really experimented with PEDs, but like if I did, it would have been so easy to get away with it because they say they test you at any time. We could show up when you're on your winter break, summer vacation, things like that. But they never did. And there was, I think I went 3 years without getting tested. Like it was, and guys, some guys took it. A lot of guys chose not to. But yeah, that's also something to consider, how it would affect college sports, even high school sports, with guys going straight to the draft at a high school and the NBA, baseball, the whole landscape. So yeah, I mean, it definitely does open a huge can of worms. If you legalized steroids at the top level, it would definitely trickle down to when teenagers are willing to use it. Maybe you're willing to use it earlier if you know that it's being done at the highest level. I don't know.
I think the concern at the time of the Balco stuff was this was pushing down into prep athletics, or could. And at some point you have to ask why you're having sports programs in schools, what they're for. And it would get you to address some really fundamental questions. Are you just trying to build a few elite athletes who go on, or is there some benefit to every kid who participates? It's basic philosophical stuff.
Yeah. So Jeff Novitzky is an instrumental guy in this investigation. Who was Jeff Novitzky? I see some golden snitch nicknames being thrown around online about him. So who was this guy? What was his job? And like how is he key in overturning this Balco investigation?
What's a golden snitch nickname? I don't even know what that means.
Apparently his nickname now is the Golden Snitch.
What?
I know he was involved in testing. I believe it was UFC testing and maybe some.
Yeah, he works for UFC.
Yeah,
he works for UFC now.
And apparently his nickname is the Golden Snitch. I searched some articles about him, some interviews, and he responded to the Golden Snitch nickname in a clip from Joe Rogan, but I'm not sure of the entire context of where that name came from. Joe Rogan said it came from another comedian. Brennan Schaub claims to have given him the name, who is also a former UFC fighter. But I don't know. I assumed it was alluding to him making a name for himself, being seen as a snitch on pro athletes, if I was gonna guess, but I don't know what the nickname came from or who gave it to him.
I see. I don't know. Yeah,
could be another investigation.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Lance, do you
sure.
want to profile?
Novitzky was a good aggressive cop when we knew him or knew about him and followed him. He was an IRS agent, but he was IRS criminal, so he could get into this other kinds of stuff. And he was personally really interested in the steroid stuff and was and worked really hard to make his cases. Went out of his way to do things. He was criticized by at least one fellow officer for personalizing the attempt to prove Bonds was a steroid user. He and it's true that whole probe, they were very aggressive in trying to make their cases, but never so much that it cost them anything in court. I know some time ago he left law enforcement and now is working with the UFC and as their drug commissar or something. And I don't know anything about him then, but at the time he seemed like a good aggressive cop. That was just me.
Yeah. He was a former. He'd been an athlete himself, basketball player and a track athlete, and successful in high school and college for a period of time, and then became this guy who doggedly, he was digging through trash. He was digging through medical waste to make this case, basically. And there's, I think the athletes and others shredded him, and went after him, and lawyers went after him. But there was nothing ever to suggest like he was anything but this guy who basically made this case and was critical to being able to expose all these guys.
Yeah, and literally dumpster diving, pulling drug schedules out of the trash, going through medical waste. It seems like, this guy was super hardcore about what he's doing, which is what you want from someone who's investigating a scandal like this. And so it makes sense that if guys do hate him now that are athletes, or he has that reputation in those circles, that maybe he takes it as a compliment. I don't know. But based on what he was doing in Game of Shadows and the things you guys wrote about, he was tremendously thorough, borderline obsessed, he was an IRS guy too. Mm-hmm. You mentioned he was a cop, but wasn't he also he was part of the IRS when he started investigating?
Yeah, they have
Balco?
a criminal division, and I guess they came into this looking at tax stuff at one point, but
yeah, I think they got tips about there were various tips that had sort of started to emerge around this, and they were all related to this sort of question of distributing PEDs, but no taxes being paid. And that's why it's an Internal Revenue Service investigation from the criminal side. And he was, as Lance said, this, Lance is using the term cop as like he's the criminal, he's a criminal investigator.
And just an aggressive guy. When Barry Bonds' ex-girlfriend made an appearance on Geraldo, I think, like a 5-minute appearance on Geraldo. 2 days later, Novitzky's at her door. It was stuff like that. He would jump on stuff. He would go anywhere, do anything, looking for evidence, looking for stuff. I guess he was part of the group. They were trying to flip Bond's trainer, Greg Anderson. And he was part of the group that Greg's wife was some kind of masseuse. Was that it? And they put a pregnant FBI agent in with her as a client to try to get to Greg's wife, to try to get to Greg, to try to flip Greg. I mean, they were really going for it on that case. They were trying everything they could think of to bring home convictions. This was after they were going after Bonds for perjury. And in the early going, picking up Balco's garbage every week, taking it and going through it and pulling out documents and drugs and all kinds of stuff that actually helped them quite a bit.
Was there ever a point where either of you were afraid for your lives or well-being? Because you're dealing with industries that make billions of dollars every year. The government's getting involved. There are a lot of rich, powerful people that have a lot of incentives for this to not come out. Was there ever a point where you were like, someone could just roll up on me walking from work or something, take me? Because like journalists do get, beat up occasionally or executed. Like there's a history of journalists getting messed up.
Well, Zach, we were more worried about the government, actually. They were trying to send us to prison.
Yeah.
But
yeah, we weren't. I don't ever remember feeling physically in danger or worried about my physical livelihood from fans. I mean, we got every possible piece of hate mail and horrible things said about us that you could, but I never remember feeling physically threatened. But as Lance said, the concern became when the government decided that they were going to come after us and needed to know where we got our material.
This was the contempt of court?
Yeah, that they were threatening. Yeah, basically, so they, we published the grand jury testimony of a number of athletes. The judge decided she wanted an investigation into that after people complained about it. The FBI launched an investigation separately in Los Angeles into where we got our material, and that sort of created this drama and saga in which we were subpoenaed to come testify before a federal grand jury to say where we got our stuff. Lance and I both refused, of course, and we were threatened with prison for up to 18 months. And so,
wow, 18 months.
That was the biggest fear, I think, to our own personal livelihood that we felt during the
I did have we got all kinds of negative stuff from fans, and I did have a personal encounter with a Barry Bonds fan that I can't forget. Mark and I had been on some talk show in LA, a sports talk show, and the next day I was on BART, the mass transit train in the Bay Area, going to the Oakland Coliseum to meet my son to go to an A's game. There was a guy on BART, and he was looking at me, and he was a pretty buff guy. And as the train starts rolling into the Coliseum station, he goes, "Is it personal with you and Bonds?" I didn't say anything. He says, "It's personal, isn't it, between you and Barry? It's personal, isn't it?" And so I got off and started walking down the platform, and he runs out of the train and starts yelling, "Barry's not going down, you going down." So I thought that was, I don't know, it was kind of negative feedback, but he didn't lay hands on me. It is one reason why I didn't go to the Giants ballpark since this started, because I was always worried of winding up being on the Jumbotron and then getting trapped in my seat,
So the government wanted to throw you in jail for up to 18 months, you said, for contempt of court, for not turning over the sources for the grand jury testimony?
True.
Correct.
Did anyone end up going to jail for this investigation? Like, what was the longest someone went away?
So it's a bittersweet piece of the story for us. So the dealers themselves spent virtually no time in prison. Victor got 4 months in prison and 4 months of house arrest.
Jesus. So you could have spent more time in prison for not turning over the information that led to the arrest.
Oh, three times.
Zach, when we got in trouble, I was like, okay, I could do 4 months. I mean, Victor did 4 months. I could do 4 months. I thought there would be some, balance like that. But I remember our lawyer talking to me. He says, no, Lance, you don't understand. They're going to put you away for 18 months, and then they might come back and convene a new grand jury and try to put you away for another 18 months. There was no perspective like you'd think they would have. They acted like Mark and I had blown up a police station. I mean, they went after us so hard. It was crazy.
And Greg, and nobody else. I mean, Greg did 3 months in house arrest. then 3 months prison, 3 months house arrest. And then the feds, they ended up, not from us helping them separately, they found another way to get to our sources. And they ended up charging a guy, and he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. So here was a whistleblower in the truest sense, providing information that helped expose these athletes. And the whistleblower ended up being sentenced to 2 years. He ended up serving 14 months, I think, and then was out on house arrest for another period of time, lost his law license. So that guy served more than 2 or 3 times the amount of time combined of any of the drug dealers in the case. And the athletes, of course, served no
Barry
time.
did house arrest in Beverly Hills for a month. Yeah.
Oh, Barry did house arrest for 30 days in Beverly Hills. That's right.
I would take that. That's a vacation.
For his deal that got,
I'd volunteer for
that. Then got overturned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So who was this guy that went away? Is this public information? The guy who ended up that leaked the grand jury testimony?
Yeah. So the reporting is public, and that he's a lawyer named Troy Ellerman, who was a lawyer for one of the defendants in the case. And I think what Lance pointed out very early on in the case that was so frustrating was, I think the reason Lance thought he'd be off this case so short is that when the government indicted these guys for dealing the drugs, he thought that all the athletes would be identified, the drug users would be identified, we'd know who did what and when. Instead, when the government indicted everybody, the 4 guys who were dealing the drugs, they redacted the names of all of the athletes. They protected the identity of all of the athletes. And so I think a lot of people around the case, not just us, were like, what the fuck is going on? Why are they protecting all of the athletes? They're treating this as if it's a normal drug case in which they're going after the dealers as opposed to the users. In reality, the users in this case were the famous athletes, some of the most famous athletes in the world, and they were being protected and sheltered. And so we had a number of sources who worked with us because they felt like that was fucked up and wrong.
Yeah.
And Ellerman has publicly talked about being one of those people. And in, I think, both of our minds, he's a whistleblower in the truest sense of what whistleblowers do and are. And unfortunately, he got caught. And the government brought the full force of the government down on him, and he suffered for it considerably.
What is it that makes the government go after the whistleblowers harder than the people who are actually committing the crime? Because it doesn't make any sense. Like once the information is out there, and you refuse to leak your source, it's kind of on whoever was in charge of that information to keep a better eye on it or not give it out there. Like they're taking the risk. But once you get your hands on that information and it is evidence of a widespread scandal, it seems like it would be in the government's best interest to want to go after these guys who are committing the crime. And there's a lot. I know there's a lot of people that suffer as whistleblowers who come out and say things that are, the illegal shit's going on, things are not what they seem, and they get fucked a lot of times, it seems like.
I mean, we need many things in the United States, but one thing we need is legislation that protects whistleblowers better than it is now, because the act of whistleblowing sometimes requires somebody to do something procedurally wrong or bad or forbidden, but there's a overarching good being performed, I think. That's what we thought in our case. I mean, like Mark says, when they indicted Victor, they could have laid out in general terms who his clients were. I mean, instead of rewriting court records to refer to Barry Bonds as a baseball player, for example, or just blacking stuff out, just tell us what's going on here. It was the only thing that interested the ordinary people in the case to begin with, was what were the athletes doing? Go figure.
Is there something Is there something about the Balco scandal and the investigation in general that people consistently get wrong, even with all the reporting you guys have done and the information that's out there? Is there a misconception, something that people will consistently say that's just not right?
That's a great question.
That's a good question. That's a really
but I'm
good
not
question.
sure there is. After the audience got used to it being true, there was a long period of time when, as we said, the audience was in total denial about what was going on. But I think eventually they came around, and I think they got the story. What do you think, Mark?
I think that's largely true. I think there was still. I think there's still an element. You Zach, you alluded to this at the onset. This idea of like hard work, and I think that there's still, for those people who don't want this to be a real thing or don't want, I think there's still a level of denial about how effective the drugs are. And so, which is maybe not getting it wrong, it's maybe more being in denial as a fan. There was always a lot of stuff like, well, these didn't help Barry hit a baseball. Like, it didn't help his eyesight. It couldn't do this or it couldn't do that for him. And all of those things, when you talk to people who lived in the drug world and understood the way the drugs worked, were wrong. People knew that the drugs were actually effective in helping everything from focus to, in some cases, eyesight and strength. And I remember early on, we were talking to a reporter when we heard about a player who was caught up in Balco, and we talked to this reporter about it because they had covered that athlete, and they were like, "Oh, there's no way that person would never use those drugs." And besides, they worked so hard; they were in the gym every single day, working to be able to build their body the way they did. And that's just a smart colleague who we have great respect for and who's really good at their job, but who just frankly didn't understand. The reality was taking the drugs enabled them to be in the gym every single day, working hard over and over again without recovering. And so I think there's still a lack of understanding necessarily about how effective the drugs are and the ways in which they help athletes in all sorts of levels.
Yeah, and for me, when I've had conversations about steroids and things like what effects does it have on athletes, how can you tell? It seems like the biggest misconception to someone who has no idea about steroids or maybe just knows from pictures and the videos that were coming out around the time of the scandal, a lot of people think that when you take steroids, any steroid, it drastically changes your appearance. And that is how you know that someone is on steroids. And if they don't come back with 30, 40 pounds of muscle next season, then that means that they're not taking anything. But, knowing what I know about steroids now and having been around some guys who had taken certain performance enhancing drugs during my playing career, I know that you can become immensely stronger and quicker and recover faster, much faster, without obvious changes to your physical appearance. You may get a little bit bigger, but you may be taking drugs that are not designed to make you bigger, but to make you recover at superhuman speeds or give you more pop when you hit a ball. You may not have gained 30 pounds, but when you hit a baseball, it goes 40 feet farther. And that's the difference between a double and a home run. So like that to me seems to be the biggest misconception, that there are these obvious telltale signs in people's physical appearance that you can just look at them and tell, like finger snap, they're on it or they're not. And it seems like it's much more complex than that.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. I think it's totally right. The drugs work.
Oh yeah.
The drugs work, and they work in a range of different ways for a bunch of different athletes in all the different sports. And all athletes are they all don't look the same. They're all not big, cute, hulking, muscular weightlifter types. There are a range of shapes and sizes, and for every sport, you could find a value to using one of these substances.
So as we end off, it seems like Game of Shadows is just as much a story about egos as it is about the steroids themselves. Is there something to be said about the human ego and how it can drive you to go down a certain path and how that feeds into each other? Once you've decided to do something, your ego is a very powerful thing to get you there and make you believe that you're doing the right thing.
Well, that's the Bonds story. Bonds wasn't taking steroids because otherwise he wouldn't make the major league roster. Bonds didn't come from a deprived, impoverished background like someone like Miguel Tejada, the old A's shortstop, who was a street urchin in Dominican Republic, so you could kind of understand. No, Bonds was just offended because other guys were using steroids and they were getting all the attention as power hitters, and he wanted to remake his game so he would get all the attention. It's not, maybe it was a matter of some money, but he already was a multimillionaire. It was just wanting to be the best, right? Wanting to be the focus.
Yeah, and I think, I think overall, even, for these guys at all varying levels, right? I mean, I think this as a former athlete yourself. Like there's a level of ego that needs to go with the ability to succeed at that level, especially at the highest levels, right? There's a level of not only self-discipline, but and athleticism, but also ego and self-confidence and need to be the sort of central focus of the world, right? And similarly, in many cases, having been given stuff and treated, better than others for years. And so with that, I think comes this sort of level of almost confidence that this is what I'm doing is fine. What I'm doing is necessary. And nobody else can really understand the need for me to do these things. And these are choices I'm making, not because they're wrong. They're choices I'm making because they're necessary for any number of reasons, whether they're, like Lance said, because Barry's jealous of McGuire and Sosa, or whether it's Dan Nolte to try and survive and make it in the league, and get, a few more miles an hour on his fastball, whether it's some young kid who thinks he needs to do it to get to the highest level. I think there's all some level of ego that sort of circles around all those kinds of decisions, right?
Yeah, that no one understands me vibe is usually when my ego starts to take over the hardest in my own life, when I'm like, I'm alone on this island. No one else has ever faced this problem before. No one has my complex, tough problems in the way that I do. Therefore, my actions are justified in a way that no one else is justified to take them. So it's the ego is such a bitch because it's necessary to achieve great things, but also it'll lead to your downfall.
No doubt.
Very true.
Well, thank you so much, guys, for taking the time
this was pretty
to appear
fun
on the podcast.
Yeah, we got going.
Thank you, Zach.
Yeah, this was an absolute blast. Where can people follow you? Where can they follow your work? Instagram, Twitter, websites, things like that. And I'm going to link this all to wherever people are watching this, whether it's on YouTube or you're listening to this on Spotify. These links will be in the description.
Well, I'm still working. Lance is fortunately able to sort of do his own thing, and he's working, but able to sort of live a life.
Yeah, I don't have a website. I guess
Lance, are you on house arrest in Beverly Hills?
It's like that. It's like that. I've been doing a project for my old paper, the San Francisco Chronicle, and I'm working on a true crime podcast with some other guys.
You got a Twitter feed?
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I'll send you that.
Twitter?
How's that? I'll send you my.
Send me anything you want to be linked.
My Twitter handle. How's that?
Yeah.
Perfect.
And I'm at ESPN, so that's where most of my stuff shows up, and I have a Twitter handle as well, and I'm on Facebook, and I haven't really delved into Instagram, or I feel ancient, especially compared to my kids who laugh, I think, at what I'm not on.
Yeah. I mean, I'm 28 years old, and I feel like a new platform comes out every day.
It's true.
So I'm starting to feel that way right now.
It's true.
Instagram, Facebook used to be for old people. Now people are saying Instagram is for old people. I'm like, I just got on this 4 years ago. But thank you guys. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, it's totally fun.
An absolute blast.
Thank you. Thanks for the info, Zach. Appreciate it.
Let us know when it's out there.